Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Today, we're going to be talking about the astrological ages and how this notion of the astrological ages fits in with this other grand historical narrative of human consciousness evolution that we've been sketching out in our series about Jean Gebser's text, The Ever-Present Origin. So, just to be clear right off the bat, this is going to be a video which is about astrology. So, if you're just stumbling into this video out of nowhere or whatever, and you think astrology is like dumb or pseudoscience or a thing that only women take seriously, which is like a hilariously common take apparently, then just go watch something else, I guess, because I'm trying to wean myself off of nicotine right now. I am in the mood to fight a wild honey badger with my bare hands, and I just do not have the patience to spend the next 45 minutes trying to convince you that astrology is real. So, yeah, go away. Anyway, so to start with the bare basics, what are the zodiacal ages? So, to put it really simply, without getting into a lot of the astronomical nitty-gritty, the answer to that is that there's this thing called the precession of the equinoxes, which makes it so that over time, the sun will be in different zodiacal constellations during the spring equinox, the March equinox. So for the past 2,000 years-ish, the sun has been in the zodiacal constellation of Pisces during the spring equinox. In the future, or arguably now, depending on how you want to carve it up, the sun will be in Aquarius during the spring equinox. So then we will be in the zodiacal age of Aquarius. Now, there's endless debate to be had about when exactly the ages begin or end, different ways of measuring this, different ways of like putting the sidereal and tropical ways of looking at things into contrast with one another, and we're just not gonna get into all that. We're gonna get to the stuff that I think is actually interesting, which is taking this way of looking at history, basically carving it up into these 2,000-ish year chunks, and then comparing that to this Frankenstein meta-narrative that I've been trying to weave together from the works of Jean Gebser, Karl Jaspers, Julian Jaynes, etc. So, again, to kind of gloss over the nitty-gritty, you've basically got something like this. You've got a period from about 2000 or 2200-ish BC up to 0 AD, which is the age of Aries. And then you have a period from 0 AD to thereabouts 2000 to 2200-ish AD, which is the age of Pisces. And then after that, we'll be moving into the age of Aquarius. Now, one interesting thing about this is that when we look at the zodiacal ages in this way, this precession is actually moving backwards through the zodiac, right? So we're going Aries, Pisces, Aquarius. Throughout the course of the year, the sun moves in the opposite direction, right? We would be going from Aquarius to Pisces and then Aries, right? So it seems to be moving backwards, unless you're looking at things kind of from the opposite direction. If you're looking at where the sun is rising, then it appears to be moving backwards. But if you look at where it is setting, conversely, you actually get a forwards progression. And this is something that I don't think other astrologers have ever really pointed out, that perhaps the age of Aries had something kind of Libra about it, that the age of Pisces might have had something kind of Virgo about it, and that the age of Aquarius then will or is having something kind of Leo about it as well. And so what I want to propose here is something like this. If these zodiacal ages are happening in these 2,000-ish year chunks, then maybe we can break them in half into 1,000 years of daytime, essentially, a 1,000-year diurnal period, let's say, And then the second 1,000 years being a kind of nocturnal period, right, where the sun is setting, is going towards its descendant, let's say. So what this, I think, would imply then is something like this, and this is the way I want us to look at things. The age of Aries, again, 2200-ish to 0-ish BC, that gives us the age of Aries. And I would say that whole period is Aries. But the second 1,000 years in particular takes on this very Libra quality to it. So the Aries is still there, but now Libra is really coming into play. And so for the age of Pisces as well, at around that 1000 AD mark, right? The Pisces is still there, but now Virgo is coming in a new and interesting way and kind of complementing the Pisces-ness of that zodiacal age. So if we look at history in this way, does it line up? Do we actually seem to see these archetypal forces at work? I think we actually do. And I think we actually see this in some pretty interesting ways. So let's go to that initiation point of the age of Aries. So 2200 BC-ish, moving forward, this pivotal period, we should see the initiation of some very powerful transformations. And we do. We find that the Akkadian Empire in ancient Sumeria was collapsing and would give rise to a fragmented array of warring city-states. We see the end of the Old Kingdom in Egypt, which likewise would give rise to this kind of fragmented political situation. The Bronze Age collapse would also take place in roughly the same time period. And that's a whole conversation unto itself about the sea peoples and the potential role of climate change in all of that. This is also around the time that we start to see the earliest developments, the earliest flowerings, we should say, of Minoan civilization, which is going to lay the groundwork for what will eventually become Hellenic civilization, the civilization of ancient Greece and later Rome. And really overall, when we look at this period, we're seeing breakdown, we're seeing destruction, which is going to result in birth, the emergence of novelty. And this is a pattern that certainly we see throughout history. Old structures break down and new ones come about. But nonetheless, this is a pretty dramatic example of such a widespread collapse. And in fact, it wasn't just in this kind of Middle Eastern Mediterranean realm that we see this kind of thing happening. It was also occurring in China. But in any case, a lot of the transformations that are happening here, a lot of the breakdowns that are occurring here are going to lay the groundwork for essentially all of the major players that are going to be characteristic of the Bronze Age, namely Babylonian civilization, the Israelite civilization, Hellenic civilization, and the later developments of Egyptian civilization. So what exactly is Aries? Now, in my way of looking at things, I generally think that you can understand just about everything you need to know about a zodiacal archetype by looking at it as a certain elemental expression of a planetary personality. That, I think, can get you basically everything you need to know, at least for the basics, and then you can begin kind of fleshing that out by looking at the way that zodiacal archetype is situated in relation to the zodiacal signs that are adjacent to it or opposite, those that have the same elemental constitution, that kind of thing. So with Aries, I would initially start looking at this as the fiery expression of the archetype of Mars. So Mars is action. Mars is initiation. Mars is assertiveness. Mars is really the power of activity, the power to overcome obstacles, a force which is in many ways very much associated with archetypal masculinity, certainly. And in a lot of ways, it's very much astral, we could say, very much sentient, okay? And that means that it's operating at this level that's a bit higher than the bodily, right? Whereas something like Pisces or Cancer, you have these archetypes which are very much associated with these kind of gut feelings, visceral feelings. Aries is a bit more idealistic because Mars is quite a bit more idealistic, one could say. But Aries in particular is very much an archetype where you have this impinging of the ideal upon the real. I think that's probably a good way of putting it, because Aries is the fire modality of Mars. So what is fire? Fire is the ideal. Fire is the transcendental. Fire is the value of the form in itself. Fire is the empyrean, right? And fire is sacrifice. Fire, unlike the other 3 or 4 elements within alchemical and astrological thinking, fire is the one that requires sacrifice in order to be maintained. Water and air do not require the consumption of bodily matter in order to maintain their existence. They can just carry on with what they're doing. Fire is not like that. Fire demands sacrifice. So why is that? Fire demands sacrifice because fire is the ideal that is aspired towards. We can think about this in very personal ways, right? How often is it that in order to get to where you need to be, you have to let go of things? You have to cut ties. You have to abandon the solidified, repetitive habits which you have become locked into, right? The solid stability of the bodily world sometimes needs to be cut, severed, immolated in order for the ideal to be realized. And Aries is that. Aries is the ideal asserting itself, ingressing itself, insisting itself into our natural, immanent world. And when it does so, it breaks things apart. Very much like Uranus, in a certain sense. Very much like Uranus, Aries is an archetype of combustion. And this is precisely what we see at the initiation of the age of Aries, combustion. Specifically, combustion, which is going to be paving the way for the realization of something new, the realization of something that has, at this point, only been intimated. So now let's fast forward a bit. We're not done with Aries. Like I said, this Aries essence is going to maintain itself all the way to the end of this 2,000-year period, but at around the 1,000 mark and moving forward into the initiation of the Common Era, this is where I believe that we're going to see this Libra energy coming into play. So it's around this time that we see the beginnings of the axial age, right? And so I believe Carl Jaspers himself really puts this at about 800 BC. He puts it as like 800 BC to like 300 BC or something like that. But I think we can really look at this entire period of about 1,000 to 0 as having a certain character to it. And in fact, it has a certain character which corresponds very well to what I've described as the discursive structure of consciousness. right? So this is what Jean Gebser would call the mental structure of consciousness, but I've kind of refinagled the terminology for the sake of clarity. So what's happening during this time period, right? We're seeing things like Taoism. We're seeing things like Confucianism in China. We're also seeing the development of really all of classical Greek philosophy, right? Everyone from Anaximander and Socrates, of course, Heraclitus, Parmenides, Pythagoras, Aristotle, the whole gamut. All of that is going to occur within this period. And if you saw part 2 of our series on the ever-present origin, allegedly about the ever-present origin, it's kind of become its own thing now, but whatever, then you'll recall that one of the major transformations taking place during this period is this kind of internalization of this power of individual, practical, prudent discernment, right? And so when we look to Julian Jaynes, right, he talks about the way that in the Iliad and the Odyssey, really the Iliad in particular, this ideal of this kind of juridical prudence, discernment, is embodied within the goddess Athena. And Athena brings this into play from on high. But then we fast forward a bit, and we can see the Odyssey is really kind of a halfway point. But if we fast forward then to the Socratic dialogues, we find that this power of discernment has been completely internalized into the individual human being, right? When Socrates is going around asking his questions and whatnot, going through his whole dialogical process, he's teaching people how to exercise that kind of discernment, this very Athenian discernment for themselves, so that they are able to discern truth via the activity of their own intellects, right? There's a trial, as it were, which is taking place. This is all very Libra. Truth is being put on trial. The old ways are being put on trial across Eurasia. And ultimately, this is going to culminate in something, right? And it's going to culminate in a way that dovetails with the very Aries aspects of this narrative as well. We're going to have the Libra and the Aries coming together with the story of Christ, the crucifixion, the resurrection, that whole shebang is going to be the culmination of all of this within that mystery of Golgotha, as Steiner calls it. We're going to have really reality itself put on trial, humanity itself put on trial, God himself put on trial. And this will happen in a way that these Aries motifs of the narrative are also brought to their ultimate culmination. An ultimate culmination within ultimate sacrifice and ultimate rebirth of novelty. So before moving on to talk about the age of Pisces, I do want to briefly touch upon another very interesting thing that occurs prior to the culmination of Aries and Libra, and that is a triple conjunction, which Richard Tarnas points out in his book Cosmos and Psyche. A triple conjunction which has only occurred once in human history, recorded human history certainly, of the planets Pluto, Neptune, and Uranus. A triple conjunction, and this occurred around 575, 577 BC, right? And so this is kind of the apex, the crest of the wave, as it were, that is the axial age. And within his text, Richard Tarnas goes on at length talking about how we can see this kind of confluence of archetypal energies at work and the transformations that are taking place during these time periods, these massive world upending spiritual transformations of how human beings conceptualize themselves, about how the gods, about how the world is conceptualized, the development of this appearance reality distinction which I discussed in my work talking about this development of the discursive structure of consciousness. We can see how all of these fit together. Pluto is separation. Neptune is the womb. Uranus is, as previously mentioned, the eruption of the novel, which breaks apart these old solidified structures in order to make way in much the same way that Aries does. And on that note, this triple conjunction of Neptune, Uranus, and Pluto would have occurred within the sign of Aries, at least if we're using sidereal calculations, which of course we should be doing within this context, given that we're talking about the precession of the equinoxes and zodiacal ages. We are talking about something that occurred within the zodiacal age of Aries, and so that's probably the appropriate way to look at it. We could look at it through the tropical zodiac, in which case this conjunction would have occurred within the sign of Taurus, and maybe there's something to be said about that too. There probably is, but we're not going to be cracking open that particular can of worms today. Rather, the can of worms that I am interested in cracking open is going to be the age of Pisces. Now, of course, you guys have probably seen the Jesus fish, right? You're familiar with this notion that there's some kind of symbolic connection between Christ, Christianity, and the fish of Pisces, with the symbolism of the fish, the Vesca Pisces. What is that exactly? What does that amount to? If we're looking at these things as metaphysical, cosmological symbols, then what exactly is being gestured towards here? Now, this is the part where things are going to get a little blurry, potentially, because even if you've seen my entire series about the ever-present origin thus far, even if you've watched every single video that I've ever released here on Formscapes, then it's not going to help too much, because I have yet to actually give an explicit articulation of what my interpretation of Christianity actually is. So I'm going to try and do my best to make this make sense to you guys. And if not, then hopefully it'll make more sense a couple of videos from now, a couple of video essays from now. Well, we can start with this at least. The fish is, as I said, the Vesca Pisces, right? So what is that? It's the intersection of two circles. It is the almond shape of the human eyes, for one thing, and that is very significant. We can already start to see the significance of that, right? If you saw our last video essay where we looked in a very detailed way at the emergence of perspectival consciousness from medieval Aristotelian Christianity, right? So there's this connection there between the eye and this opening up of inner subjective space, which was really brought forth by these inner tensions that were kind of seeded in the Western soul by Christianity. But there's another side to that. The Vesca Pisces is also the vagina. And that is an equally big deal here. It actually is, I believe. And so once we start to look at the symbolism of what Pisces itself actually is, that will actually begin to become much clearer too. And we'll see that there's actually a very intimate connection between these two things. In terms of the seasons, seasonal changes that occur throughout the year, Pisces is the beginning and the end. Or maybe it would be better to say it's that which always precedes the beginning. Aries is really the beginning in a certain sense. It is that which initiates. It is the spark which sets in motion the beginning of this process of catabasis and anabasis, ascent and descent. And Pisces is that which underlies that. It's what precedes birth. And what precedes birth? The womb, the uterine state, the oceanic state of existing within the womb, within the embryonic fluids. Pisces is really, to just go ahead and put my cards on the table, I think I can say this, to put it very bluntly. Pisces is the inner darkness of human consciousness, which precedes subjectivity. So it precedes our sense of division between self and world. Okay, and you can, depending on which way you're looking at it, you can see either Aries or Aquarius, or both of them, as these initial sparks of subjectivity that kind of fan outward, branching out from Pisces, from that Piscean darkness, dark waters, which are kind of like this sea of potentiality from which selfhood, subjectivity can then be born. People with a lot of Pisces in their natal chart are people who tend to be very go with the flow, in a sense. They tend to be people who are very drawn to happiness, to good feelings. They want to feel good things, and they tend to shy away from anything that feels negative, feels oppressive, feels like it might demand too much of them, because ultimately Pisces people feel things very, very deeply, and they feel them in a very visceral way. In order to understand why that is, we have to understand what feeling is, and this is not as obvious as you might think. There's actually a lot of connections here that we need to make in order to really make sense of this. Feeling is plasticity, or rather I should say that plasticity is potential for feeling, because feeling is allowing something to change you, right? So think of like a lump of clay, right? It's not fired yet. It still has this liquidity to it. You can push your thumb into it and leave a thumbprint. Why? Because there's still plasticity there. There's still indeterminacy there, right? Once the clay has been fired, once it becomes solidified, that indeterminacy has been destroyed. It's been removed. You can't put your thumbprint into it anymore. You can't take that vase and make it into some other kind of clay jar or jewelry or something like that. It's already been determined, right? Pisces, therefore, is this ultimate capacity for depth of feeling, because it is ultimate indeterminacy, right? So the more indeterminacy there is, the more capacity for feeling there is. Because there's more plasticity, there's more capacity for that which we come into contact with to change us, to impress upon us. Whereas if you kind of look at the psyche as this kind of nested set of layers, these more outward layers are going to be, generally speaking, much more dense, much more solid. They're going to be much more like the armor that we build around that inner darkness in order to protect it, because that potential for depth of feeling within that inner darkness is also vulnerability. It is also potential for pain. And we learn that very, very early on in our childhoods. And we start developing coping mechanisms. We start developing defenses against trauma by building these layers around that core of inner darkness that is represented by Pisces. People with lots of Pisces in their natal charts are people who maintain a direct connection with that inner world of depth of feeling in a way that others often do not. So this is very interesting. What this implies is something that we really see very explicitly in Eastern philosophy, that awareness as such, the kind of consciousness, capital C, right? In this very general sense, consciousness in the sense of pure experientiality, pure potential for experience, which precedes the sense of division between self and world. That ocean of pure awareness is nothing. It is literally emptiness. And this is exactly what we see within various traditions of Eastern philosophy. And strangely enough, it's there too in Western philosophy, but it's always in this very veiled state. It's always spoken of in these very hushed tones almost, because Western philosophy, the Western soul, very oftentimes can be seen to have this much more ambivalent relationship, this much more emotionally conflicted relationship with the divine darkness, with the nothingness, the no-thingness, which underlies the world of form, which underlies the tangible experiences which occur within these fields, which are themselves emptiness. It is not just that they are empty, they are emptiness, right? Because that's really what awareness is, and that's what Pisces points us towards. It points us towards this darkness, which is capital C consciousness. When Plato talks about this divine darkness, this nothingness, this formlessness, which is the receptacle, the womb, which has to be impregnated by the masculine transcendental world of forms, he calls it the Great Mother, the Cora, the receptacle. And Plato is, again, rather ambivalent about this, and later Neoplatonic writers are going to be even more ambivalent. Plotinus in particular, when he writes about the prima materia, which is the exact same thing, it's just another term for the Cora, the divine darkness, he's going to take this almost explicitly hostile attitude towards darkness, towards the divine darkness, but he's going to conclude, interestingly, that this darkness is the formless form, as it were, of pure apparentness, right? So what does that mean? It means it is the condition for the possibility of any arising within consciousness at all, right? The form of mere apparentness is pretty much the exact same thing. In fact, it is the exact same thing, I would argue, as the form of experientiality, of the possibility of feeling itself, right? And so that's the womb. That's why we see this connection there with the Vesca Pisces. It's why it is a symbol of the vagina. So now we got to ask, what exactly does that have to do with Christianity? Because if we can make that connection, then we can make this further connection between the vagina and the I, the womb and the I amness, which arises out of it. So the connection here, in my opinion, is that within the story of Christianity, specifically within the crucifixion of Christ, you have a kind of ultimate confrontation with the inner darkness which resides within the core of human subjectivity itself. Okay, I know that's kind of a mouthful, and unfortunately, I am not going to go on a huge thing explaining exactly what I mean by that in excruciating detail, because that's what we're going to be doing in the next couple of videos. But if you saw the last video, then I think you can begin to see the connection that I'm making here, right? Because if we look at what's happening in the Renaissance, and really even before the Renaissance, we see this beginning in the 13th century. We see it with the number 0, being introduced into Europe, which this is originally an Indic concept, right? The number 0 originated in India, and it would make its way into Europe through the introduction of Arabic numerals. During this exact same time period, we have these medieval Christian mystics like Hadavik of Antwerp and Angelo of Foligno and Meister Eckhart coming into this confrontation with a kind of divine darkness, this empty, formless, undifferentiated infinity that they were encountering, which they identified as the ground of God's existence. That's the way that Meister Eckhart would put it, the groundless ground, right? We fast forward then to the Renaissance and to what followed the Renaissance. What we're seeing here then is this awakening of human subjectivity to itself in this very self-reflective way, and in a way that we really just do not see in Eastern traditions or really at any other time or place throughout human history. And this is an awakening to subjectivity, to individual human personhood as an inner space, as an inner world of experiences, right? So you can see how we're connecting the dots now, right? We're coming into a confrontation with this darkness which kind of radiates outward from us, as it were, from this little nucleus of selfhood, which we experience to be somewhere behind our eyeballs. We feel that to radiate outward and to encompass all of our experiences. And what is that thing? What is that light that radiates outward from us? Well, it's actually darkness, because that formlessness, that indeterminacy is the possibility of experience, the potential for feeling. So what I'm going to argue in more detail moving forward in the next couple of videos is that this encounter with our own inner darkness, which we see in the Renaissance, and we're going to see it become even more and more explicit as we move through the German idealists, through figures like Schopenhauer and Nietzsche and Heidegger. This confrontation with inner darkness is not only set in motion by Christianity, not only forecasted by Christianity, but it is in fact a reenactment of the exact same process that we see Jesus of Nazareth going through during the process of the death and resurrection, the crucifixion and the subsequent resurrection. These are all fundamentally the same process. This, I believe, is actually the ultimate underlying connection between Christ and Pisces. It's that Christ, in many ways, and in many very crucial ways, represents this confrontation, this encountering or reunion between human consciousness and this darkness, which is itself a very much maternal sort of thing, a womb. Now, if we're being consistent with the narrative I'm trying to tell thus far, then by the time we get to the 13th century, let alone the Renaissance, we're already entering into a period in which Virgo has come into play. It's no longer just Pisces at work, because now we're also looking at the other half, as it were, the setting of the sun. And so Virgo is the earth modality of Mercury. Virgo is very meticulous, very editorial. Virgo is an archetype of discernment, very much like Libra in certain ways, but more oriented towards creation, practical creation, rather than that discernment being in service of a higher ideal of consonance or harmony or order. Virgo is more practical than Libra, we could say. And at this stage in history, we're already starting to move in such a direction that we're seeing the emergence of what Oswald Spengler is going to call Faustian civilization, right? We're already seeing the Gothic spires. We're already seeing the towers. And ultimately, this kind of Germanic, Faustian, Promethean civilization is going to become the Age of Sail. It's going to become the great empires of the 19th century, the clockwork, the steam engines, the railroads. All of that is going to emerge from Faustian civilization, and all of that is going to have this very distinctly Norse-Germanic character to it, right? So that's really what Spengler is describing as Faustian civilization. And this is interesting because within these Norse-Germanic Celtic cultures, the All-Father, the chief god, is not Jupiter. Rather, it is their equivalent of Mercury, interestingly, right? Odin. Odin does have certain Jovian features, but nonetheless, Odin is not Thor. Odin is not Jupiter. Odin is not Zeus. Odin is kind of a wanderer, an explorer, a figure who gets into wacky misadventures in his quest for hidden arcane knowledge. So when we look to something like Faust himself, Goethe's Faust, we can certainly see a bit of Odin in there, can't we? But if we're looking at Odin as really a distinctly Norse-Germanic expression of Mercury, of this specifically Virgo-type mercurial energy, then we can really see this throughout all of what we would otherwise describe as modern civilization, right? The printing press is rather Virgo, is it not? Factories, editorial boards, stock markets, lots of these things. The age of sail, the age of exploration, the development of academic science, academic philosophy, all of this has this very Virgo type mercurial energy to it. And we can see how there's this connection there between Faustian civilization, Norse Germanic civilization, Odin, Mercury, and Virgo. And it is, I believe, at this halfway mark, thereabouts, around 1000 AD, because that's when the schism happens, right? Between the Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox churches. That, I believe, is what's going to lay the groundwork for this Virgo power to begin to ingress and to begin to shape what will eventually become Faustian or Promethean civilization. So let's take a step back now from the astrology and start looking at this more in a kind of mythical, alchemical way. So let's now refer to my cosmic Taurus tree of life diagram thing that I've been kind of putting together over the course of these last few videos and look at what's going on here. Now, if we begin with the archaic structure and start looking at this in terms of the days of the week, right, which the alchemists saw as outlining this kind of alchemical process of transformation, we can attribute the archaic structure to the day Friday, right? Friday, so that's Venus, right? Then the magical structure would be Saturn, Saturday, right? Okay, so think about this for a moment. When the magical structure is worshiping this Gaia, this Earth Mother goddess, this is Venus, effectively. And this right here is really funny because not in one, but in two videos, I very, very confidently declared that the so-called Venus figurines that we see from the Paleolithic epoch were not really Venus, because I was thinking that they were Neptune, which they are. But, as we'll see, I was wrong. I was totally wrong, because they're totally Venus and Neptune, and there are reasons why this should have been obvious to me already, but we'll get to that. Either way, slightly embarrassing, but yeah, the Venus figurines, they actually kind of are Venus. Whoops. Anywho, so fast forward a bit. So the mythical structure, right? So think of classical Greek civilization, right? When they're looking back to the magical, what do they call that? They call it the golden age of Saturn, right? So you've got Venus, Friday, Saturn, Saturday. Then you have the two polarities of the mythical structure, right? So you have Tiferet and Yesod, right? So Sunday, Monday, right? Day of the sun, day of the moon. And then you have Tuesday, which is Mars, right? So this is the age of Aries then. This is the age within which discursive consciousness is ultimately going to come to fruition, even though the age of Aries begins within the mythical structure. I would say the culmination of the age of Aries is going to give us that discursive consciousness. And so we see this era is being ruled by Mars, right? So next, we then have Wednesday, and that's Odin, the day of Odin, right? So that's Mercury, right? And so Mercury, Virgo, as the rulers of the perspectival age. And then subsequently, now that we can now move into the post-perspectival, the aperspectival age, the age of what I've started calling envisionary consciousness, the Sabbath, we find to be Thursday, the day of Jupiter, right? And so this is interesting, right? Because the next phase of Earth evolution, according to Rudolf Steiner, is what he calls future Jupiter. Now, of course, most Abrahamic religions are not going to identify the Sabbath as Thursday. There are reasons for that, all kinds of historical stuff with regards to like the sun or Saturn and how we think about these different archetypes and yada yada. We're not going to get into all that, but no, I'm not saying that like Sunday isn't actually the Sabbath. It's actually Thursday. There are different ways of looking at these things, right? And I think what we're looking at here is a very high-level perspective on this, which is very illuminating in many ways, because we have a seventh day here, which within this way of looking at it would qualify as the Sabbath, right? The day in which there's this passing over, right, into the world of spirit, the world of psyche, from the world of corporeality. And as we can see here, it is the perspectival. It is subjectivity, which serves as a kind of mediator between those worlds. Now, there's a number of things to point out here that I think are very interesting. The first, probably most obvious thing, is that we've got 7 days, but we've got more layers than that, don't we? And that kind of begs the question as to what will fill those slots, right? And I think the answer here is actually pretty straightforward. It's just the planets that were not accounted for within the traditional 7 days of the week. Once we move up into Yesod, again, the realm of the moon, which will be the first mirroring of the mythical structure, that I believe will be the kind of Neptune day, right? Because if we look to the astrochromogram, we can see that in a sense, Neptune is a kind of higher octave or perhaps lower octave of the moon. Next, we have the sun, once again, mirroring the mythical structure. And it's here, I believe, that Uranus will come into play. And this, I believe, corresponds to what Steiner is actually calling future Venus within his outline of the future of human evolution. Then finally, we have the recapitulation of the magical structure, right? So we're once again coming into the realm of the Plutonic. And this, I believe, will be ruled by Pluto, because it just seems rather appropriate that the inside and the outside would come into a kind of correspondence at this stage, right? And that's really what's going on here, I believe. With these weekdays, what we're seeing is the archetypal energies that are shaping the world in general, transpersonally, let's say. Whereas with the trees of life, what we're seeing there with the Sephira is a breakdown of the archetypal forces which are acting upon the human being from within and shaping us internally. And so that leaves but one more layer up at the top, the final layer. And this would correspond to what Steiner would call future Vulcan, the final state of Earth evolution. And I think he was completely spot on for calling it that, because I believe in terms of these weekdays, these archetypes that are shaping the world in general as a whole, it is here that Vulcan comes into play. Now, recall in the last video, the video about perspectival consciousness, I argued that it's Vulcan that is operative internally within human beings through the perspectival age, right? So we have Vulcan operating from within, and we have Mercury operating from without, and also Virgo, right? So once we get to the end of this progression, then we have Vulcan operating from without. We have the state of the Earth, which is future Vulcan. So what is Vulcan then? Now, in the last video, I argued that Vulcan is actually the god of a lot more than we tend to give Vulcan credit for. I argued that as the god of magma, Vulcan is actually the god of the syzygy, of the highest and the lowest. You have the combination of the divine celestial fires of the Empyrean with the lowest, with the cold, inert, ossified, fossilized remnants of the past, the earth, the stone. And with lava, with magma, we have a combination of the two. We have the two merged together. Vulcan also represents volcanoes, and so you have the eruption of novelty into our world. Furthermore, Vulcan is also the god of the forge. And so, what is a forge exactly? It's technology. Technology actually had quite a bad rap in ancient Greece. The ancient Greek culture tended to see reliance on technology as a kind of weakness. They saw it as kind of feminine, in this very negative way. But, even in the modern world, we more spiritualistic, more philosophical types tend to look at technology with quite a lot of suspicion, right? We see technology as that which has alienated us, dehumanized us, as that which is inframing the natural world, unworlding the world, as Heidegger would say. And this is all true. There's absolutely plenty of justification for seeing technology in a negative light. But if we can peer past the superficial, then I think we see something a bit more interesting. The forge takes ore. It takes the raw materials of the earth and uses fire. Fire as in thought. Fire as in ideation to purify those raw materials, to create something that then has a very specific place within the harmony of a human life world. In a sense, all technology is doing this. All technology is taking these raw materials which are the past, the concrete products of thought, of spiritual activity, which become the past. We're taking those raw materials and we're trying to redeem them, to recreate them in such a way that they're able to participate in this grand symphony that we are trying to create. So, although machine technologies might be very limited, might be very dangerous, might indeed be unworlding and dehumanizing, nonetheless, technology could potentially be much more than that. If we could have technology which goes beyond the mechanistic, which goes beyond the digital, technologies which are somehow formative in essence, which actually take psyche into account, which take consciousness into account, which take the teleological trajectory of our world into account. Technology could prove to be something rather different. Technology could prove itself to have been all along the impulse towards the spiritualization of the bodily, the redemption of the bodily, not through deanimating it, not through dematerializing it, as the Christian Aristotelians would have it, but rather through harmonizing it, reincorporating it into a more encompassing symphony. So that, I believe, points us, hints at the direction we are moving in. It suggests, intimates what this future Vulcan might be, and tells us quite a bit about why the perspectival age would be the age of Vulcan. So, with all that said, I think we can now move on to some related topics. So one would be Aquarius, right? So age of Pisces is, if not over, then approaching the end, let's say. And what is coming next is said to be the age of Aquarius. So what does that mean? So what is Aquarius? Let's ask that question first. Well, Aquarius is the air modality of Saturn. Now, as we've discussed previously, Saturn is fundamentally the archetype of inertia. It is a power of contraction, stillness. It is a force of solidification, densification. It is, in a sense, the will of the past to remain as it is and to continue into the future. It is the giant boulder rolling down a hill that just wants to keep rolling and doesn't really give a damn about your pretty little house that happens to be in the way. Saturn is the giant monumental mountain which simply stands there as civilizations rise and fall. But wind, air, pneuma, prana, this points to something rather different, doesn't it? Because the air modality of Saturn, then, it would be the inertia of something else, something that's not solid. It would be the continuity, the inertia of the spiritual, of pneuma, of prana itself, the continuity of the past in a more spiritual modality. Aquarius is the archetype of ghosts, phantoms. With the glyph of Aquarius, we see these double wavy lines, right? Which very much intimate the notion of resonance. Wavelengths lining up with one another, interacting with one another. If this is making you think of morphic resonance, then you're on the right track, because that's definitely an aspect here. Aquarius is a kind of liquidity in much the same way that Pisces is, but they're quite different. Pisces is a kind of immanent, embodied liquidity. It is deeply empathic. It feels very deeply, but what it feels is embodied, present, immanent. Aquarius is more like a radio receiver. Aquarius tunes in to the past, but it tunes into a higher level of subtlety, let's say, rather than the concrete, the physical, the somatic. But then if we look at this in terms of human psychology, we can see Aquarius in a rather different way that's actually quite interesting and connects a lot of these dots together. Aquarius is the continuity of that which is most fluid, but most fluid and also subtle, right? So Pisces, in its own way, is the continuity of that which is most deeply rooted within us, this kind of primordial darkness that is this primordial awareness, Atman, Brahman, right? Aquarius is, I would say, a stage higher than that. It is the first form of subjectivity that arises from that darkness. Because subjectivity requires the conceptual. It requires self-conceptualization. And so this is why what Aquarius tunes into is conceptual, whereas Pisces, what Pisces encounters, what Pisces is most receptive to is that which is more imminent. So Aquarius, in a lot of ways, is the inner child. It is the deepest layer of our subjectivity, which is not the deepest layer of our selves in this like much more encompassing like Atman Brahman sense, but it's the deepest layer of us as distinct individuals, where there actually is a kind of boundary between self and world. And so that lowest layer of our subjectivity is that which is most liquid. It is that which is most receptive. It is that which is most plastic, because as we age, as we mature, we build these layers around that, which are really designed to protect it. Again, the liquid is also vulnerable. We have to build these denser shells of armor around that inner child and that inner darkness in order to protect them. This is why romantic relationships tend to be very, very difficult, because the kind of vulnerability that is needed in romantic relationships is that vulnerability of the inner child, of the inner darkness. In order to have genuine intimacy with another person, you have to let those guards down, tear down those walls, take off that armor. And that's easier said than done very oftentimes. So when we talk about the need for vulnerability in relationships, this is what we're talking about. We are talking about Pisces and Aquarius. So if there's something very archaic about Pisces, there's something very magical about Aquarius. And I'm referring here to Jean Gebser and his structures of consciousness, right? Archaic, magical, mythical, discursive, and so forth. And this magicality of Aquarius is this kind of radio receiver-like conceptual receptivity of the inner child, fundamentally. Now, with that said, then, that implies that there is this connection between Aquarius and the magical structure, which is the birth of human subjectivity in general. And it also implies that there's a connection here between Aquarius and Pluto, because Pluto is also the governor, as it were, of separation. It is separation which generates subjectivity from transpersonal oceanic awareness. In order for subjectivity to arise from that ocean of awareness, there must be a fissioning apart. The infant in the womb must separate from the mother, and this is the reasoning behind why I kind of restructured Stanislav Grof and Richard Tarnas's perinatal matrices, because I believe that Pluto is really there in the birth itself, in the separation of mother and child, where the infant's respiratory and circulatory systems quite literally reconstitute themselves very rapidly in order to create a self-contained system which is now independent from the mother. So, with all that said, we can now begin to look at why the Pluto-Aquarius cycle has been so significant within the past several hundred years of human history, really the past 1,000 years of human history in particular. Now, I'm not going to go over that entire story because I covered this in much more detail in the video titled Celestial Spheres and the Collective Unconscious, where we really talked about the Pluto-Aquarius cycle in detail. If you want a really detailed examination of the Pluto-Aquarius cycle, then Chris Brennan from the Astrology Podcast has a very in-depth video looking at that. But some highlights from that we can go ahead and look at real quick. There was a Pluto-Aquarius period during the Italian Renaissance, during the height of the Italian Renaissance, in fact. And Pluto takes about 248 years, something like that, to go around the entire zodiac. So the next Pluto-Aquarius period was the late 18th century. It was like 1781 to 1793 or something along those lines. Again, the dates are a little fuzzy depending on things like retrogrades and whatnot. I'd have to look up the exact details. But nonetheless, Pluto's in Aquarius during this very pivotal time period of the late 18th century, right? We have the American Revolution, the drafting of the United States Constitution, the French Revolution, Immanuel Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, the birth of electrical technology with Volta's voltaic pile, pretty much everything that we regard as distinctly modern about our modern world began during the last ingression of Pluto into Aquarius. And for those of you who are aware of what's going on with the stars right now, you'll know that Pluto is currently in Aquarius and will be there for quite some time. It initially entered Aquarius in, I believe, March of 2023, briefly retrograded back into Capricorn, and then I think there was another in and out thing before Pluto finally entered Aquarius to stay in November of 2024, and it has been there ever since. And what that implies, I would say, is that the significance of our current time period is going to be equivalent to what we saw during the Italian Renaissance and the late 18th century. That's kind of a big deal. That kind of means that things are about to change in a way that is going to be quite profound. And we can already see that in certain things. Artificial intelligence, of course, is the thing that people just won't shut up about. And it does seem to be the case that artificial intelligence is poised to become a very significant player in terms of geopolitics, not to mention economics. But there are other things. I believe there are other, even more profound gears which are turning right now, and I don't think it's quite clear what those gears are. Things are a lot clearer with hindsight, of course, but we can see a number of things. We can see a massive resurgence of interest in spirituality, which is, I would argue, quite different than any other kind of spiritual awakening which we've seen before. And I think that's the case because young people, millennials, Zoomers, are re-engaging with spirituality from this far more philosophical, far more rationalistic perspective. This kind of thing has always existed in some sense. There's always been esoteric philosophy, esoteric metaphysics. These things are not new. But nonetheless, to see that kind of interest happening at a mass scale, maybe not quite a mass scale yet, but certainly a popular scale, let's say, that's new. That's new, and that's something very interesting, I believe. And that's something that I think could have quite major consequences for the world in general, depending on how that comes to fit into the bigger narrative which we are currently a part of. So why? Why has the Pluto and Aquarius cycle been so significant over the past 1,000 years? The answer isn't just that we are approaching the age of Aquarius, though that's definitely part of it. The answer, I believe, at a deeper level is that Pluto in Aquarius represents this confrontation with our deepest sense of alienation from the world, our deepest sense of being a subjectivity which is separated from the great nameless infinity that we find ourselves within. And that is of particular significance in the current phase of this grand narrative because of Christianity, I would say. Again, I haven't fully unpacked my interpretation of Christianity for you guys, and so this might come across as a bit vague, but ultimately I think that's what's happening here. In the story of Christ, the death and resurrection, the whole shebang, what we're really seeing is this deep, primal level confrontation with that ultimate sense of alienation. And I think that this is why Pluto and Aquarius together represent these peaks in the movements of this narrative by which we as a species are undergoing that same kind of transformation at a somewhat glacial pace and slow motion, as it were. We're moving through a kind of birth canal, as it were, and reenacting a lot of the traumas of that kind of alienation. Father, why hast thou forsaken me? And what's on the other side? A number of things. One of them, for certain, is going to be some kind of reconciliation with this archetypal father. And I can say that for certain because I believe that the age that we're about to be moving into is the age of future Jupiter, as Steiner calls it. And that is what the Jovian archetype is. It is the archetypal king. We've lived through an age, in fact, we were all born into an age in which there was this very widespread disavowal of the king, widespread disillusionment in the father, whether literal fathers or the father god or monarchism in general. There's this very deep, very widespread, very ubiquitous disavowal of the Jovian archetype. Part of this narrative, it's a very complex narrative to be sure, but part of this narrative is going to be reuniting with that aspect of the world. And I think that's going to be largely through re-encountering that within ourselves. Jupiter is the ruler of Pisces, after all. That's interesting, isn't it? Well, I guess that's enough crypticness for one day. So, yeah, I'll see you guys in the next video essay. Take it easy.